In the winter of 1756, in a remote plantation house along the James River in colonial Virginia, 7 members of the prestigious Calverton family died within hours of each other during what should have been a celebration dinner. The local magistrate's records, sealed for over 2 centuries, reveal that every single victim showed identical symptoms: violent convulsions, blackened tongues, and a peculiar sweet scent emanating from their mouths that witnesses described as almonds mixed with honey, yet carrying an underlying bitterness that made even hardened men retch. What made this case even more disturbing was that the enslaved woman responsible, Sarah Williams, had served the family faithfully for 15 years without a single incident of defiance, rebellion, or even minor infractions that would have marked her as potentially dangerous. The colonial authorities buried this case so deeply that even today, historians struggle to find complete records of what really happened that December night. Court documents were deliberately scattered across multiple county archives. Witness testimonies were sealed under orders that remained in effect for over 200 years. And physical evidence was destroyed in what officials claimed was an accidental fire just months after the trial concluded. The few surviving fragments of the investigation paint a picture so disturbing that some modern scholars question whether the full truth was ever recorded at all. Before we continue with the story of Sarah Williams and the Calverton plantation, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from, because this tale of calculated revenge and botanical knowledge will shake you to your very core, revealing secrets about plantation life that the colonial elite never wanted preserved for history. The truth about that fatal dinner would remain hidden in dusty courthouse archives until a restoration project in 1987 uncovered a water-damaged trunk containing the original testimonies, and what they revealed about the sophisticated resistance networks operating within Virginia's slave communities was far more terrifying to the established order than anyone had imagined. The Calverton plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of fertile tobacco fields in Charles City County, Virginia, where the James River curved through the countryside like a brown serpent carrying the wealth of the colonies toward the Atlantic. In 1756, this was the beating heart of colonial Virginia's tobacco empire, where vast fortunes were built on the backs of enslaved Africans and the humid climate that made the golden leaf flourish under careful cultivation. The plantation represented everything that colonial Virginia aspired to become: a successful transplantation of English aristocratic ideals onto American soil, powered by forced labor and sustained by the brutal efficiency of human bondage. The plantation house itself stood as a testament to English architectural ambition transported to the New World. An imposing brick Georgian mansion with twin chimneys and 12 symmetrical windows that gazed out over endless rows of tobacco plants stretching toward the horizon. The structure had been built in 1721 by Edmund's father, using enslaved craftsmen whose skills in brick-making, carpentry, and masonry had been honed through generations of forced labor on similar projects throughout the Chesapeake region. The house featured imported glass windows, hand-carved woodwork, and a formal garden designed to mirror the great estates of England, though adapted to the Virginia climate and available plants. Master Edmund Calverton had inherited this empire from his father in 1739, along with the 43 enslaved people who worked the fields, tended the house, and maintained the complex machinery of plantation life. At 52, Edmund was known throughout the county as a shrewd businessman who had expanded his holdings considerably since taking control, purchasing additional land along the river and investing in the latest agricultural techniques recommended by London tobacco merchants. His reputation extended beyond Virginia's borders. His tobacco commanded premium prices in English markets, and his plantation served as a model that other colonial planters visited to study his methods. His wife, Margaret, came from the prestigious Randolph family of Richmond, one of the oldest and most influential families in colonial Virginia. Her marriage to Edmund in 1729 had been as much a business arrangement as a romantic union. bringing together two powerful plantation dynasties and consolidating control over tobacco trade routes along the James River. Margaret had brought with her both extensive social connections throughout Virginia's planter elite and a substantial dowry that had funded the plantation's expansion into rice cultivation along the river bottoms, diversifying the Calverton holdings and providing additional sources of income during years when tobacco prices fluctuated. The Calverton household in the winter of 1756 included Edmund and Margaret, their three children, who represented the future of the plantation dynasty. Margaret's unmarried sister, who served as companion and assistant in managing household affairs, and Edmund's business partner, whose financial connections had become crucial to the plantation's continued expansion. Thomas, aged 24, had recently returned from 3 years of education in London, where he had studied the latest agricultural innovations and business practices that English planters were implementing in their Caribbean sugar colonies. His exposure to these new ideas had created tension with his father, who preferred traditional Virginia methods that had proven successful for decades. Catherine, aged 21, embodied the carefully cultivated refinement that plantation families used to distinguish themselves from smaller farmers and urban merchants. She had been educated by private tutors in music, French, and the domestic arts that would make her an attractive marriage prospect among Virginia's planter aristocracy. Her engagement to Richard Pemberton, son of a wealthy Richmond tobacco merchant, represented another strategic alliance that would further strengthen the Calverton family's position in colonial Virginia's complex web of commercial and social relationships. Young Edmund Jr., aged 16, was being groomed to eventually inherit and manage the plantation. Though his education had been complicated by what his parents considered dangerous tendencies toward egalitarian thinking picked up from interactions with Quaker merchants who occasionally visited the plantation on business. His father had grown increasingly concerned about his son's apparent sympathy for the enslaved people under their control, viewing such attitudes as both morally misguided and potentially threatening to the family's economic foundation. Margaret's sister, Patience Randolph, aged 38, had never married due to a scandal in her youth involving inappropriate attention to an overseer on her father's plantation. She had found refuge with the Calvertons, where she served as household manager and companion to Margaret, though her presence was a constant reminder of how quickly social standing could be lost through poor judgment or unfortunate circumstances. Colonel James Hartwell, Edmund's business partner and frequent houseguest, controlled the shipping networks that carried Calverton tobacco to European markets. His connections with London merchants and his ownership of several vessels had made him indispensable to the plantation's profitability, though his relationship with the family was complicated by his obvious attraction to the widowed Patience and his increasing influence over plantation business decisions that Edmund sometimes resented. Among the enslaved population, Sarah occupied a unique position as head cook and kitchen supervisor, a role that gave her unusual authority and responsibility within the plantation's rigid hierarchy. Born around 1720 in what is now Angola, she had been captured during tribal warfare and sold to Portuguese slave traders operating along the West African coast. Her journey to Virginia had taken her first to the Caribbean, where she had spent 2 years on a sugar plantation in Barbados, before being purchased by a Virginia tobacco merchant who recognized her potential value as a skilled domestic worker. Her African name had been lost to history, replaced by the Spanish Sarah Hope, given to her by the Barbados plantation owner, who had briefly held her before selling her to Virginia buyers seeking experienced house servants. The name carried cruel irony, as hope was precisely what the slave system was designed to destroy. Yet Sarah had somehow maintained not just hope, but the intelligence and determination to act on it in ways that would ultimately terrify her oppressors. What made Sarah remarkable within the enslaved community was not just her culinary skills, which had earned the Calverton table a reputation throughout the county for sophisticated meals that rivaled the finest houses in Williamsburg and Richmond, but her apparent literacy, a dangerous and strictly illegal accomplishment for an enslaved person in colonial Virginia. The ability to read and write was viewed by plantation owners as a direct threat to the slave system, as it enabled communication, planning, and the spread of ideas that could undermine the careful control mechanisms that kept enslaved people subjugated. The plantation operated under the typical brutal efficiency of the period, with every aspect of daily life organized around maximizing tobacco production and maintaining absolute control over the enslaved workforce. Enslaved people rose before dawn to tend fires, prepare meals, and begin the endless cycle of agricultural labor that defined their existence from birth to death. The tobacco fields required constant attention throughout the growing season, planting in carefully prepared beds, transplanting seedlings, weeding, topping, harvesting, and the complex process of curing the leaves in specially constructed barns, where temperature and humidity had to be maintained within precise ranges to produce the high-quality leaf that commanded premium prices in European markets. During the winter months, when field work slowed, enslaved people repaired tools, processed food for storage, prepared materials for the next planting season, and performed the countless maintenance tasks required to keep the plantation operating efficiently. This seasonal rhythm had continued unchanged for decades, creating routines and expectations that both enslaved people and their owners relied upon for predictability and control. Punishments for infractions were swift and severe, administered either by Edmund himself or by his overseer, Jeremiah Cook, a harsh man who had earned a reputation throughout the county for creative cruelties that served as examples to other enslaved people while stopping just short of damaging valuable property beyond repair. Cook had been hired from a South Carolina rice plantation where his methods had proven effective at maintaining discipline and maximizing productivity, though rumors about his specific techniques were whispered rather than spoken openly even among the white community. The winter of 1756 had been particularly difficult for the Calverton plantation, with an early frost in October damaging a significant portion of the tobacco harvest and reducing the plantation's income just as substantial debts from recent land purchases were coming due. The damaged tobacco had to be sold at reduced prices, and several planned improvements to the plantation's infrastructure had been postponed indefinitely. Most devastating to the enslaved community, Edmund had been forced to sell 2 families to a South Carolina rice plantation to raise immediate cash, separating parents from children and husbands from wives in transactions that demonstrated the absolute power plantation owners held over every aspect of enslaved people's lives. The remaining enslaved community watched these separations with the resigned horror of people who understood their own vulnerability to such arbitrary destruction. Families that had been together for years could be broken apart with a single business decision, and the knowledge that similar sales might be necessary in the future created an atmosphere of constant anxiety and desperation that permeated every aspect of daily life on the plantation. In the weeks leading up to December, tensions in the Calverton household had been building to dangerous levels. Thomas Calverton had returned from his studies in England with expensive tastes and radical ideas about plantation management that conflicted sharply with his father's traditional methods and conservative approach to change. He had proposed implementing new techniques he had observed on Caribbean sugar plantations, including more intensive cultivation methods and the purchase of additional enslaved people to expand production. But his plans required capital investments that the plantation's current financial situation made impossible. Catherine's engagement to Richard Pemberton had become a source of stress rather than celebration, as the marriage negotiations had stalled over financial arrangements complicated by the plantation's reduced circumstances and uncertainty about future tobacco prices. The Pemberton family was demanding guarantees about dowry payments and inheritance provisions that Edmund was reluctant to provide given his current financial pressures, while Catherine herself had begun to express doubts about marrying into a merchant family that she considered beneath her social station. Young Edmund Jr., had been caught several times fraternizing with enslaved children his own age, behavior that his father considered both inappropriate and potentially dangerous to the family's authority and the plantation's disciplinary structure. The boy's apparent sympathy for enslaved people and his questions about the morality of slavery had alarmed his parents, who feared that such attitudes could undermine their ability to maintain control over their workforce and could damage the family's reputation among other planter families. December 15th, 1756, dawned grey and bitter cold, with frost coating the bare branches of the massive oak trees that lined the quarter-mile drive leading to the Calverton mansion. The temperature had dropped during the night to levels that threatened the winter vegetables still growing in the plantation's gardens, and enslaved people had risen even earlier than usual to tend fires and protect valuable food stores from freezing. Inside the great house, preparations were underway for what Edmund had declared would be a celebration dinner to mark the end of the harvest season and to discuss important family business with Colonel Hartwell, whose shipping connections and financial advice had become crucial to the plantation's survival during these difficult economic times. Sarah had spent 3 full days preparing for this dinner, which she understood from overheard conversations to be more significant than the usual family meals. The dinner would serve multiple purposes, celebrating the completion of another tobacco season despite its disappointing results, discussing strategies for improving the plantation's financial situation, and making important decisions about the family's future that would affect every person living on the plantation, enslaved and free alike. She had supervised the slaughter of a prize pig that had been fattened specifically for this occasion, directed the preparation of preserved vegetables from the plantation's extensive gardens, and even requested special spices from the locked pantry, where Margaret Calverton stored the precious imported seasonings that distinguished elite plantation cuisine from the simpler fare of smaller farmers. The menu had been planned to showcase the best of the plantation's production while demonstrating the sophisticated cooking techniques that had made Sarah's reputation throughout the county. The planned meal included roasted pork with complex herb stuffing made from sage, thyme, and other herbs grown in the plantation's garden, sweet potato pudding flavored with molasses and spices, cornbread made with the finest cornmeal and enriched with eggs and butter, winter greens cooked with bacon and seasoned with vinegar, and a special rice pudding flavored with vanilla and cinnamon that required expensive imported ingredients and careful preparation techniques that few cooks in colonial Virginia had mastered. In her testimony, later recorded by Magistrate William Braddock, Sarah described the day's preparations with remarkable precision and attention to detail that demonstrated both her intelligence and her careful observation of everything happening around her. She had risen at 4 in the morning to begin the slow roasting of the pork, carefully tending the fire in the kitchen's massive hearth and adjusting the spit to ensure even cooking throughout the long day ahead. The kitchen itself was a substantial separate building connected to the main house by a covered walkway, a common arrangement designed to reduce the risk of fires spreading to the main residence while also providing a buffer zone that separated the domestic labor of enslaved people from the refined living spaces of the white family. This physical separation between kitchen and main house would later prove crucial to understanding how the poisoning occurred without affecting any of the kitchen staff or other enslaved people who had access to the food during its preparation. The walkway that connected the buildings created opportunities for observation and intervention that a fully integrated kitchen would not have provided, while the separate building meant that cooking smells, heat, and the constant activity of food preparation remained isolated from the family's living areas. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah noticed several unusual occurrences that she would later recall with disturbing clarity during her interrogation. Master Edmund had visited the kitchen twice, something that rarely happened under normal circumstances, each time engaging her in conversation about the evening's menu and asking specific questions about ingredients, preparation methods, and timing that seemed to go beyond mere curiosity about the meal. His questions had focused particularly on the spices being used and the exact schedule for serving each course, details that had never concerned him during their 15 years of working relationship. Margaret Calverton had also made an unprecedented appearance in the kitchen during the afternoon, examining the dishes being prepared and suggesting modifications to the seasoning that required access to additional spices from her locked pantry. Her behavior had seemed nervous and distracted, unlike her usual calm authority when overseeing household affairs, and she had asked repeatedly about the timing of the meal and whether everything would be ready precisely at 6 o'clock. Most significantly, Colonel Hartwell had requested a private tour of the kitchen facilities during the late afternoon, claiming interest in the cooking methods and equipment that produced such renowned meals. He had examined the hearth, the preparation areas, and even the storage spaces where ingredients were kept, asking detailed questions about food preparation and safety that seemed unusual for a gentleman whose interests normally focused on tobacco and shipping rather than domestic arrangements. The dinner was set for 6 o'clock, just as the winter darkness settled over the plantation and candlelight began to flicker in the windows of the great house. The timing had been chosen to allow for extended conversation after the meal, when business matters could be discussed without the formality that characterized daytime meetings between planters and their associates. The family and their guest gathered in the formal dining room, a grand space dominated by a mahogany table imported from England that could seat 12 people, though tonight only 7 chairs had been arranged in the precise pattern that reflected the social hierarchy of colonial Virginia plantation society. The news of what quickly became known throughout Charles City County as the Calverton Massacre sent shockwaves through the entire colonial Virginia plantation system, challenging fundamental assumptions about the security and stability that white planters had built their lives around. Within hours of Jupiter's frantic midnight ride to summon the magistrate, armed men from neighboring plantations had surrounded the Calverton buildings, and every enslaved person on the property was placed under heavy guard, while investigators attempted to understand what had happened in that elegant dining room and whether the incident represented an isolated act of rebellion or part of a broad conspiracy that threatened the entire regional slave system. Magistrate William Braddock arrived at the plantation before dawn on December 16th, accompanied by Dr. Samuel Hayes, the county's only trained physician, and Reverend Thomas Whitfield, who served both as spiritual counselor and unofficial coroner for unexplained deaths in the rural areas where professional medical examination was rarely available. What they found in the dining room defied their limited understanding of poison and medicine, presenting symptoms and evidence that challenged everything they thought they knew about the capabilities and knowledge of enslaved people. The 7 bodies lay in various positions where they had fallen during their final moments, their faces contorted in expressions of agony that spoke to the intensity of their suffering, but with none of the typical signs of the common poisons known in colonial Virginia. There was no foaming at the mouth, no obvious discoloration of the skin, and no evidence of the violent vomiting that characterized most cases of accidental poisoning from contaminated food or deliberate poisoning with substances like arsenic or mercury that were occasionally used in domestic murders. What struck all the investigators immediately was the distinctive blackening of the victims' tongues and the lingering sweet almond scent that still permeated the room hours after the deaths had occurred. Dr. Hayes, whose medical training consisted primarily of a 7-year apprenticeship with a physician in Williamsburg and extensive study of European medical texts, was particularly puzzled by these symptoms, which matched descriptions he had read of certain exotic poisons derived from plants found in tropical climates, but nothing in his experience with colonial Virginia medicine had prepared him for this systematic execution of an entire family. The investigation that followed over the next several weeks revealed the complex web of relationships, resentments, and desperate circumstances that had been building within the Calverton plantation community for months or even years before reaching its deadly culmination. Under aggressive and often brutal questioning by Magistrate Braddock, who understood that the security of the entire slave system might depend on uncovering the full scope of whatever conspiracy had made this mass murder possible. Several enslaved people reluctantly provided testimony that painted a disturbing picture of increasing tension and carefully hidden planning. Sarah, a 28-year-old woman who worked as a house servant and had daily access to the family's private conversations, revealed under interrogation that she had overheard heated arguments between Edmund and his son Thomas about the future management of the plantation that had grown increasingly bitter over the past several months. Thomas had apparently proposed selling additional enslaved families to raise capital for implementing new agricultural techniques he had learned about during his studies in England, including the purchase of additional land and the construction of new tobacco curing facilities that would require substantial initial investment. More disturbing still, Sarah testified that she had heard Edmund discussing with Margaret the possibility of selling Sarah herself, despite her valuable skills and long service to the family, because her advancing age was making her less productive, while her knowledge of letters and numbers made her potentially dangerous as an example to other enslaved people who might be inspired to seek an education. These conversations had taken place in the family's private sitting room, where Sarah worked daily cleaning and maintaining the furnishings, and where the family apparently felt safe to discuss matters they would never mention in the presence of other white people. The testimony of Moses, a 40-year-old man who worked as the plantation's blacksmith and general repairman, provided additional context for the growing desperation and anger that had been building among the enslaved community during the months leading up to the poisoning. Moses revealed that Sarah had been secretly teaching other enslaved people to read and write using pages torn from old almanacs, discarded newspapers, and religious texts that she had somehow acquired over the years, creating an illegal education network that had operated for years without detection by the white overseers or family members. This clandestine school had met in various hidden locations around the plantation, including abandoned tobacco barns, sections of the slave quarters that were not regularly inspected, and remote areas of the forest where enslaved people were sent to gather firewood or medicinal plants. The education network had grown to include more than a dozen participants, both adults and children, who were learning not just basic literacy, but also mathematical skills that could be used for planning and organizing resistance activities. Most significantly, Moses reported that in the weeks immediately before the dinner, Sarah had made several unusual requests for access to different areas of the plantation that had previously been outside her normal responsibilities. She had asked for permission to collect herbs and roots from the forest areas beyond the tobacco fields, claiming she needed them for medicinal purposes to treat sick enslaved people. A request that had been granted because plantation owners generally encouraged enslaved people to maintain their own health using traditional remedies rather than requiring expensive treatment from white physicians. She had also requested permission to clean and organize the storage areas where various agricultural supplies were kept, including substances used to kill rats and other pests that threatened the valuable tobacco stores during winter months. These storage areas contained various chemicals and preparations that were necessary for plantation operations, but potentially dangerous if misused, including compounds containing arsenic, mercury, and other toxic substances that were used for pest control and equipment maintenance. When Magistrate Braddock finally conducted his formal interrogation of Sarah herself, he encountered a woman whose demeanor completely confounded his expectations and challenged every assumption he held about the mental capacity and emotional responses of enslaved people. Rather than the terrified, submissive response he anticipated from an enslaved person accused of mass murder, Sarah displayed a calm dignity and intellectual sophistication that unnerved everyone present and suggested depths of planning and capability that the colonial authorities found deeply threatening. She answered his questions in fluent, articulate English that demonstrated a vocabulary and grammatical sophistication that shocked the white officials who had never heard her speak extensively before. Her responses revealed not just literacy, but education that went far beyond what any enslaved person in colonial Virginia was supposed to possess, including knowledge of legal procedures, understanding of property law, and familiarity with philosophical concepts about justice and human rights that were considered dangerous even when expressed by free white people. Her initial testimony was a masterpiece of strategic misdirection that demonstrated careful preparation and understanding of how colonial legal proceedings operated. Yes, she had prepared the dinner, following the same methods and recipes she had used successfully for 15 years of service to the Calverton family. Yes, she had used the special spices that Mrs. Calverton had specifically requested, accessing them from the locked pantry with permission that had been explicitly granted for this important occasion. No, she had not added any unusual ingredients or deviated from standard cooking procedures that had been established through years of experience and proven success. When pressed about her movements and activities throughout the day of December 15th, she provided detailed accounts that could be verified by other enslaved people who had observed her work, creating what appeared to be an unbreakable alibi that placed her in full view of witnesses during all the crucial periods when poison could have been added to the food. Her testimony created a timeline that seemed to make her guilt impossible to prove, despite the obvious fact that someone with access to the kitchen had been responsible for the poisoning. But Magistrate Braddock was not easily fooled by even the most sophisticated deception. His experience with previous slave rebellion cases had taught him to look beyond surface appearances and examine the deeper currents of resentment and planning that such acts of resistance required. Over several days of intensive interrogation, conducted in the cold, windowless room that served as the plantation's punishment cell, he gradually extracted a different story through a combination of psychological pressure, physical deprivation, and threats against other enslaved people who might have been involved in the conspiracy. The breakthrough in the investigation came not from Sarah's eventual confession, but from an unexpected discovery made by Dr. Hayes during his systematic examination of the victim's stomach contents and bodily remains. Working by candlelight in the plantation's ice house, where the 7 bodies had been moved to slow decomposition while the investigation proceeded, Hayes detected traces of a substance he initially couldn't identify. Small, brownish fragments that had a distinctly bitter taste when carefully sampled and that produced the same distinctive almond odor that had permeated the dining room. The discovery of these physical fragments provided the first concrete evidence of how the poisoning had been accomplished, but it also raised new questions about the source and preparation of the toxic substance. Hayes carefully collected samples of the fragments and preserved them in alcohol, then sent them to a colleague in Williamsburg who had studied with European physicians familiar with exotic poisons and unusual cases of systematic poisoning that occasionally occurred in colonial settings. The response that came back from Williamsburg 2 weeks later fundamentally changed the entire direction of the investigation and revealed capabilities among the enslaved population that colonial authorities had never suspected. The fragments were identified as processed seeds from a species of plant that grew wild in certain areas of Virginia's forests, a plant that indigenous peoples and some enslaved people had traditionally used in very small quantities for medicinal purposes, but which became extremely deadly when concentrated and prepared using specific techniques that required both botanical knowledge and chemical understanding. This revelation forced investigators to completely reconsider everything they thought they knew about the case and about the intellectual capabilities of the enslaved people under their control. Sarah hadn't simply added a readily available poison to the food in a moment of desperate rage or emotional breakdown. She had spent months, perhaps years, developing the specialized knowledge and sophisticated technique necessary to create a lethal toxin from indigenous plants, a process that required not just access to botanical information, but also the ability to experiment with different preparations, test various dosages on small animals, and perfect preparation methods that would be effective against humans, without being detected during the cooking and serving process. The investigation took an even darker and more disturbing turn when searchers following up on information provided by Moses and other enslaved people under intense interrogation discovered Sarah's hidden workspace in an abandoned tobacco curing barn located on the far edge of the plantation, well away from the main agricultural areas and family residence. This discovery revealed the true scope and sophistication of her secret activities over a period that investigators began to realize might have extended back several years. Concealed beneath carefully arranged loose floorboards that had been modified to create a hidden compartment, investigators found a collection that demonstrated not just planning for a single act of revenge, but systematic study and experimentation that revealed a mind operating with scientific precision and long-term strategic thinking. The hidden cache included dozens of dried plant specimens, each carefully labeled with notations written in a mixture of English letters and what appeared to be African symbols that none of the white investigators could decipher. The plant collection included not just the species that had been used in the fatal poisoning, but samples of numerous other potentially dangerous plants native to Virginia, along with detailed notes about their properties, preparation methods, and effects when tested on small animals. Some specimens were accompanied by precise measurements indicating dosages and concentration techniques, while others included observations about seasonal variations in plant toxicity and optimal harvesting times for maximum potency. Most shocking of all was the discovery of a handwritten journal that documented years of careful experimentation and study, written in surprisingly sophisticated English that demonstrated not just literacy, but scientific methodology that rivaled the work of trained European botanists. The journal contained detailed observations about plant preparation techniques, chemical interactions between different substances, and systematic testing procedures that revealed an understanding of basic scientific principles that enslaved people were absolutely forbidden to possess. The journal entries showed that Sarah had been conducting her research for at least 3 years before the poisoning, systematically testing the effects of various plant combinations on rats, rabbits, and other small animals that she had trapped or caught around the plantation. Her notes revealed a methodical approach to understanding dosage requirements, preparation methods, and delivery techniques that would ensure effectiveness while avoiding detection during the cooking process. One entry, dated several months before the fatal dinner, was particularly chilling in its clinical detachment and scientific precision. The bitter seeds show greatest promise when ground to finest powder and mixed with strong sweet substances that mask both taste and scent. Test subjects died quickly with larger doses, but smaller amounts produce only temporary sickness, followed by recovery. Further testing required to determine optimal dosage for subjects weighing approximately 150 to 200 pounds. The characteristic almond scent remains detectable but can be successfully hidden by honey, molasses, and strong spices when properly combined. But the journal contained much more than scientific observations and experimental data. Scattered throughout the pages were personal reflections that revealed the psychological torment and mounting rage that had driven Sarah to plan and execute mass murder. She wrote about watching enslaved children sold away from their parents, about the sexual abuse that enslaved women endured from white overseers and visitors, about the daily humiliations and casual violence that defined every aspect of plantation life for people who had been reduced to the legal status of property. Her entries described the gradual erosion of hope that occurred as she realized that no legal or social mechanism existed within colonial Virginia society to address the injustices she witnessed daily. She wrote about the futility of appealing to religious authorities who preached about Christian mercy while owning enslaved people themselves, about the impossibility of seeking protection from legal systems that defined enslaved people as property rather than human beings, and about the devastating psychological impact of living in a society that treated her intelligence and humanity as threats, to be suppressed rather than qualities to be respected. One passage, written just weeks before the poisoning, revealed her ultimate decision to abandon hope for justice through conventional means. Master Edmund speaks again of selling me to the Carolina rice fields, where the work kills most within 5 years, and where families are separated as easily as livestock. After 15 years serving his table, keeping his family's secrets, tending his children when they suffered illness, he would discard me like broken pottery, simply to raise money for his son's wasteful schemes. But I have learned the power that grows wild in Virginia's forests. And I have learned that justice sometimes requires terrible choices that good people should never have to make. As investigators pieced together the timeline of Sarah's planning and preparation, they discovered that her activities had begun nearly 2 years earlier, shortly after Edmund had first mentioned the possibility of selling some of his older enslaved people to improve the plantation's financial situation and invest in new agricultural equipment. She had used her position as head cook to gradually collect information about the family's routines, their dietary preferences, their schedules for important gatherings, and the timing of business meetings that would bring together all the family members whose decisions controlled the fate of everyone living on the plantation. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Calverton plantation intensifies beyond anything we could have imagined. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this tale of calculated revenge that shook colonial Virginia to its very foundation and revealed the sophisticated resistance networks that had been operating in secret throughout the slaveholding regions. The choice of December 15th for the poisoning had been carefully calculated based on information Sarah had gathered about the family's business affairs and seasonal patterns. The date marked not just the end of the tobacco harvest season, when final accounts were settled and profits calculated, but also the traditional time when major decisions about plantation management and enslaved people's futures were typically made. Sarah knew from overheard conversations that Colonel Hartwell would be present to discuss shipping arrangements and financial strategies, making it likely that the dinner conversation would focus on the plantation's economic problems and potential solutions, including the sale of enslaved people that she was determined to prevent. The investigation reached its most critical and terrifying turning point when Magistrate Braddock discovered that Sarah had not acted alone in planning and executing the mass poisoning, but had been part of a sophisticated conspiracy that involved multiple enslaved people and revealed the existence of communication networks that connected resistance activities across several plantations throughout Charles City County and beyond. Under the most intense interrogation techniques available to colonial authorities, several other enslaved people admitted to knowing about her activities, and a few confessed to providing direct assistance with gathering plants, testing preparations, and gathering intelligence about the family's plans and schedules. The scope of this conspiracy stunned colonial authorities, who had convinced themselves that enslaved people lacked the intellectual capacity, organizational ability, and communication networks necessary to plan such a sophisticated operation. The discovery that enslaved communities had been sharing information, coordinating activities, and developing resistance strategies challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which the entire slave system was built and raised terrifying questions about what other conspiracies might be operating undetected throughout Virginia's plantation regions. Sarah, the house servant whose initial testimony had seemed reluctant and incomplete, eventually revealed under sustained pressure that she had been part of an organized intelligence network of enslaved women who systematically gathered and shared information about their owners' private conversations, business plans, and family secrets. This network had been operating for years without detection, using enslaved people's invisibility within white households to collect detailed information about plantation finances, family relationships, political connections, and business vulnerabilities that could be exploited for various purposes. The intelligence gathering had allowed Sarah to time her attack for maximum impact and minimum risk of detection, ensuring that all the adult family members who held decision-making power over the plantation's enslaved population would be present for the fatal dinner. The network had also provided crucial information about the family's routines, their food preferences, their schedules for important gatherings, and even details about their digestive sensitivities that helped Sarah design a poison that would work quickly and effectively. Moses admitted under interrogation that he had provided more than just general knowledge about Sarah's activities. He had helped modify cooking equipment to allow her to process plant materials more effectively, creating tools that could grind seeds and roots to the fine powder consistency required for effective poisoning. He had also constructed hidden storage spaces throughout the plantation where botanical specimens and prepared toxins could be concealed from white overseers, and he had helped establish communication methods that allowed information to be passed between enslaved people on different plantations without detection. Most disturbing to colonial authorities, Moses revealed that similar networks existed on plantations throughout the region, connected by enslaved people who carried messages and shared information during their limited authorized travel for marketing, skilled labor, and other activities that required movement between different properties. These networks had been sharing information about resistance techniques, escape routes, and even coordinated planning for larger rebellions that had been discussed but never implemented due to the extreme risks involved. Dr. Hayes's continued investigation of the poison itself revealed additional disturbing details about the sophistication of Sarah's botanical knowledge and preparation techniques. The plant material she had used was not exotic or difficult to obtain. It grew commonly in Virginia's forests and had been used by indigenous peoples for various purposes long before European colonization. However, the knowledge of how to concentrate and weaponize these natural substances appeared to represent a combination of African traditional medicine, information learned through interactions with Native Americans, and original research conducted through systematic experimentation over several years. The specific preparation technique that Sarah had developed required not just knowledge of which plants were toxic, but understanding of chemical principles that allowed her to concentrate the active compounds while eliminating substances that would make the poison detectable through taste or smell. Her method involved multiple steps of processing, drying, grinding, and combining that produced a powder that could be easily mixed into sweet dishes without altering their appearance or creating suspicious odors that might alert the intended victims. The most chilling discovery came when investigators realized that the Calverton poisoning might not have been an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of resistance activities that had been occurring throughout Virginia's plantation regions for years without being recognized by colonial authorities. Records from other counties, when examined in light of what they now knew about enslaved people's botanical knowledge and organizational capabilities, revealed similar unexplained deaths in plantation families over the previous decade. Deaths that had been attributed to disease, natural causes, or accidents, but which showed suspicious patterns when analyzed with new understanding of what was possible. In at least 3 other cases within a 50-mile radius of the Calverton plantation, entire families or significant portions of families had died suddenly from mysterious illnesses that shared characteristics with the Calverton poisoning. These cases had been investigated superficially and dismissed as unfortunate but natural occurrences. But the new evidence suggested that a coordinated campaign of resistance might have been operating across multiple plantations, using sophisticated methods that had successfully avoided detection for years. The implications of this revelation terrified colonial authorities at every level of government and society. If enslaved people were capable of this level of organization and planning, if they possessed dangerous knowledge of indigenous plants that could be weaponized against their owners, and if they had established communication networks that allowed coordination of resistance activities across multiple plantations, then the entire foundation of Virginia's slave-based economy was under threat in ways that no one had previously imagined. The final confrontation between Magistrate Braddock and Sarah took place on a cold January morning in 1757, nearly a month after the poisoning, in the stone-walled punishment cell beneath the Charles City County Courthouse. By this time, the investigation had uncovered the full scope of the conspiracy, and Sarah understood that denial was no longer possible or useful. What followed was one of the most remarkable confessions in colonial Virginia's legal history. A detailed account of planning, motivation, and execution that revealed not just the facts of the crime, but the psychological and social forces that had driven a human being to such desperate and calculated action. Sarah's confession began not with the night of the fatal dinner, but with her childhood in Angola, where she had learned about plants and their properties from the women in her village who served as healers, midwives, and keepers of traditional knowledge that had been passed down through generations. She described her capture during a raid by rival tribes allied with Portuguese slave traders, the horror of the Middle Passage, where she had watched fellow Africans die from disease, despair, and the brutal conditions aboard the slave ships, and her early years in the Caribbean and Virginia, where she had gradually realized that the knowledge her grandmother had taught her about healing plants could be adapted for very different and more terrible purposes. She spoke with quiet dignity about watching other enslaved people suffer and die from overwork, disease, and brutal punishment, and of her growing understanding that the legal and social systems of colonial Virginia offered no protection, justice, or hope for people like her who had been reduced to the status of property. The decision to learn reading and writing had been the first step in her long journey toward rebellion. She had taught herself by studying discarded newspapers, religious texts, and account books, gradually developing the literacy that allowed her to document her botanical experiments and plan her ultimate act of resistance. The years of planning and preparation had been motivated not just by personal grievance against the Calverton family, but by a calculated decision to strike at the heart of the system that oppressed her entire community. By eliminating the entire Calverton family, including the children who would have inherited the plantation and continued its operations, she had sought to create chaos and uncertainty that might lead to the sale and dispersal of the enslaved community, potentially offering some individuals opportunities to escape to more favorable situations or even to freedom. Her choice of poison had been deliberate and deeply symbolic. Rather than using imported substances that would have pointed to outside assistance or exotic sources, she had used plants that grew in Virginia soil, processed with techniques that combined African traditional knowledge with careful observation and original experimentation conducted over several years. The poison represented a kind of indigenous resistance. The land itself turned against the colonizers who had claimed ownership of both the earth and the people who worked it. The most haunting part of her confession was her description of the dinner itself and the emotions she had experienced while watching the family consume their final meal. She had observed the scene through the kitchen window, feeling no satisfaction or joy as her plan reached its culmination, but rather a profound sadness for the necessity of what she had done and the terrible choices that slavery had forced upon her. She had not acted from personal hatred of the Calverton family as individuals, but from recognition that they represented a system of oppression that could only be challenged through extreme measures that violated every moral principle she had been taught as a child. When Magistrate Braddock pressed her about the other enslaved people who had assisted her planning and execution, Sarah refused to provide names or details that might implicate them further, accepting full responsibility for the poisoning, even though investigators knew she had not acted entirely alone. This final act of protection for her community demonstrated the same careful calculation and strategic thinking that had characterized her entire approach to resistance, putting the welfare of other enslaved people above her own survival, even in the face of certain execution. The confession concluded with Sarah's reflection on the likely consequences of her actions and her hopes for their long-term impact on the struggle for freedom and justice. She understood that she would be executed as an example to other enslaved people, but she expressed hope that her resistance might inspire others to find their own paths to freedom, even if those paths required choices that no human being should ever have to make. She also predicted that colonial authorities would respond with increased repression and surveillance, but argued that such measures would only reveal more clearly the fundamental injustice and inherent instability of the slavery system. Sarah was executed by hanging on February 14, 1757, in a public ceremony held in the Charles City County Courthouse Square that was designed to demonstrate the terrible consequences of slave rebellion to both enslaved and free populations throughout the region. The execution drew crowds from neighboring counties, as colonial authorities used the occasion to send a clear message about the fate that awaited any enslaved person who dared to challenge the established order through violence or rebellion. The colonial government's response to the Calverton poisoning was swift, comprehensive, and severe, involving new laws and regulations that fundamentally changed how plantation security was managed throughout Virginia. New legislation restricted enslaved people's access to forested areas where toxic plants could be gathered, imposed harsher penalties for unauthorized collection of any plant materials, required plantation owners to maintain closer supervision of kitchen activities and food preparation, and mandated regular searches of slave quarters for any materials that could be used for resistance activities. The Calverton plantation itself was sold at auction to pay the family's debts, and the entire enslaved community was dispersed to buyers across Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, ensuring that the networks and relationships that had made the conspiracy possible would be permanently broken. The plantation house stood empty for several years before being purchased by a Richmond merchant who demolished the original Georgian mansion and built a smaller, more modest residence that reflected changed economic circumstances and reduced confidence in the plantation system's stability. The site of the Grand Calverton mansion is now marked only by scattered foundation stones, barely visible beneath decades of vegetation growth and the encroachment of forest that has reclaimed much of what were once tobacco fields. Local historians have placed a small marker noting the location's significance, but the full story of what happened there remains largely unknown to most visitors who pass through the area. But the true legacy of Sarah's rebellion extended far beyond the immediate consequences for the people directly involved. Colonial authorities' discovery of the botanical knowledge and sophisticated organizational capabilities of enslaved communities led to fundamental changes in how plantation security was managed throughout Virginia and other slaveholding colonies. The incident became a case study in what colonial officials called the hidden intelligence of the enslaved population, leading to increased restrictions and surveillance that paradoxically acknowledged the sophistication and danger of slave resistance while attempting to prevent future incidents. The investigation records, sealed by court order in 1757 to prevent the details from inspiring other acts of rebellion, were not opened again until the 1980s. When historians studying colonial Virginia's legal system discovered the cache of documents during a courthouse renovation project. The detailed testimonies and evidence collected by Magistrate Braddock provided unprecedented insight into both the daily life of enslaved people and the complex strategies they developed to resist their oppression, revealing aspects of plantation society that had been deliberately hidden from historical records. Modern botanical researchers who have studied Sarah's journal and plant specimens, now preserved in the Virginia Historical Society's archives, have confirmed the sophistication of her knowledge and techniques. The indigenous plants she weaponized are now known to contain compounds chemically similar to those found in cyanide, and her methods for concentrating these substances demonstrated understanding of chemical principles that would not be formally codified by European science for several more decades. Her work represents one of the earliest documented examples of systematic botanical research conducted by an enslaved person in colonial America. Perhaps most significantly, the Calverton case revealed the existence of knowledge networks and resistance strategies that challenged fundamental assumptions about enslaved people's capabilities, aspirations, and potential for organized opposition to the slave system. The discovery that botanical and medical knowledge was being preserved, adapted, and weaponized by enslaved communities forced colonial authorities to confront the reality that their property possessed not just physical strength and labor capacity, but intelligence, organization, and determination that could be turned against the system that oppressed them. The story of Sarah and the Calverton Plantation Massacre remains one of the most complex and morally challenging cases in colonial American history, a tale that reveals both the brutal realities of slavery and the extraordinary lengths to which human beings will go in pursuit of justice and freedom when all other options have been exhausted. Her actions raise profound questions about the nature of justice, the morality of violence in response to oppression, and the terrible choices that systems of dehumanization force upon their victims. The case also demonstrates the sophisticated resistance strategies that enslaved people developed, despite facing seemingly impossible odds and absolute legal powerlessness. Sarah's ability to conduct scientific research, organize conspiracy networks, and execute complex plans while maintaining the appearance of submission challenges historical narratives that have minimized the intelligence and agency of enslaved people in shaping their own destinies and resisting their oppression. This mystery shows us that even in the darkest chapters of our history, individuals found ways to assert their humanity and fight for justice, even when resistance required choices that challenged every moral boundary and conventional understanding of right and wrong. Sarah's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the lengths to which people will go when pushed beyond endurance by systems of oppression that offer no hope for justice through peaceful means. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Sarah's actions were justified by the circumstances she faced? Or do you think there might have been other ways to resist the injustices of slavery? Do you think her scientific knowledge and planning abilities have been accurately represented in historical accounts of slave resistance? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this complex tale of rebellion, revenge, and the search for justice in impossible circumstances. If you enjoyed this historical mystery and want more stories like this that explore the hidden corners of American history and the untold stories of people who fought against oppression, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark historical mysteries that challenge our understanding of the past. See you in the next video.